Coming up on The World Today. Ukraine's military says it has destroyed key Russian control points, weapons and warehouses as it tries to take back occupied Kherson. After scores march in the funeral procession of supporters of Al-Sadr in Najaf city, many of whom were killed during clashes in Baghdad. World Health Organization officials say monkeypox outbreak can be eliminated in Europe, highlighting evidence of slowing case counts. Warm welcome to you in our Lagos studio. I'm Millicent Umoka. We begin with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The Ukrainian military saying that it launched a long-awaited counter-offensive to take back territory from Russian forces in its south, bolstered by weaponry supplied by the West. Moscow acknowledged the offensive by Ukraine near the city of Kherson, but also said it had failed and that Ukrainians had suffered significant casualties. Meanwhile, Russian shells bombarded the southern port city of Mykolaiv. The city's mayor said homes had been hit and at least 2 people killed. This latest Ukrainian offensive comes after weeks of bloody stalemate in the war. The conflict broke out when Russian troops poured over Ukraine's borders in February in what Russia calls a special military operation to rid Ukraine of nationalists and protect Russian-speaking communities. Ukraine calls it an unprovoked war of aggression. Thousands have been killed, millions displaced, and the scale of fighting is larger than anything in Europe since World War II. Russia captured much of the south early on, and now Ukraine's using sophisticated Western-supplied weapons to hit Russian ammunition dumps and wreak havoc with supply lines. A spokesperson for Ukraine's Southern Command declined to give details of the counter-offensive, saying Russian forces in southern Ukraine remained quite powerful. Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has been speaking during his late-night address, said that the newly instituted Memorial Day was to remind the world about Ukrainian losses from the 2014 Battle of Ilovaisk onwards. President Zelensky added that Ukrainian troops will chase the Russian army to the border.
This Memorial Day is set for the end of summer, August 29, to remind everyone of the tragic events of 2014 about Ilovaisk. That is war, which began with the occupation of our Crimea with attempt to seize Donbas, should end in that very place. In the liberated Crimea, in the liberated cities of Donbas, with our troops reaching the state border of Ukraine. We have always kept this goal in mind. We have never forgotten it. The armed forces of Ukraine, our intelligence, and our defense forces are doing their jobs. I'm sure you all understand what's going on, what we are fighting for, and what we're striving for. And our warriors do not need any announcement or information waves behind them. Ukraine is taking back its own.
Meanwhile, the Kremlin has said that it hoped a planned visit to the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant by the International Atomic Energy Agency goes ahead and that the visit is in Russia's interest. In a call with reporters, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said Moscow hoped the visit would take place as agreed. He said, "We have an interest in this mission and have been waiting for it for a long time." Mr. Peskov accused Ukrainian military of continuous shelling of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant and called European countries and the UK to use their influence on Kyiv to forbid it to carry on with these actions. Well, staying with the Kremlin, Moscow slammed calls by some European leaders for a visa ban on Russian tourists, saying the proposals were irrational and the latest manifestation of the West's anti-Russian agenda. At a meeting in Prague this week, European Union foreign ministers will discuss calls from the Baltic states and some others to stop granting Russians visas for access to the EU's 26-nation free movement Schengen zone. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov told reporters, quote, step by step, unfortunately, both Brussels and individual European capitals are demonstrating an absolute lack of reason. He said Europe's actions towards Russia were bordering on insanity, making it possible Brussels could push ahead with a ban in the future. He says without saying what Russia might or how Russia might respond. Eastern and Nordic EU member states have argued strongly for an outright ban on tourist visas for Russians in response to Moscow's actions in Ukraine, saying travel to Europe is a privilege, not a right. But EU heavyweights, France and Germany, are against the proposals to restrict visas to Russians, saying such a step would be counterproductive. VOA's Anna Dechnikova joins me now from Kyiv. Hi, Anna. It's good to see you. Let's begin with Russia's defense ministry saying that Russian forces shot down a Ukrainian drone that was trying to attack the Zaporizhzhia reactor complex. It also said other officials, said the Ukrainian missile hit a fuel depot at the plant. So it's like all the blame's going to Ukraine. Can you confirm this?
Good evening. Well, no, I cannot confirm that. Unfortunately, we hear a lot of acquisitions from the Russian side to the Ukrainian forces, especially around the Zaporizhzhia power plant, and especially at this point of time when the International Atomic Energy Agency mission is coming. So it looks pretty much. It looks a little bit, weird in terms of, this announcement and mission come at the same time. At least if we look at the international intelligence reports and military experts, and according to Ukrainian officials, no one did confirm, neither confirm nor presented this information. So this information comes only from the Russian side, and it's difficult to confirm it. At least we should definitely look at the international reports, and none of the international reports had this in place. Even more, we hear a lot that international community, both political community and military community, encourage Russian forces to demilitarize this territory and stop fighting around this territory. So we cannot, for the moment, we don't have any confirmation of any attacks by Ukrainian forces on the Zaporizhzhia power plant, and Ukraine is waiting very much for the International Atomic Energy Agency to come and to check the state of the plant and the state of the territory around it.
Indeed. Even the White House said that Russia should agree to a demilitarized zone around the plant. But a lot of people wonder about, the situation there, because we're hearing of iodine tablets, potassium tablets for residents living in that vicinity. We also hear that people who are fleeing other areas are actually coming to Zaporizhzhia, saying that they fear those strikes rather than the possible potential, disaster that could occur with the shelling around Zaporizhzhia's nuclear plant.
We should, look at this geographically, because unfortunately Zaporizhzhia is right in this place that people who flee occupied territories in the south, it's the only way they go through. So Zaporizhzhia is the point they go through. Some people remain there, some people continue their journey, but this is basically the main point of meeting for these people. Coming back to your question, in terms of the danger, it is danger, and people are, and the government, local government, provide people with additional iodide tablets in case any leaks are happening. Again, for the moment, we hear the reports and we follow the reports of the Enerhoatom representatives who remind and keep up to date the population of Ukraine and population of these territories which are close to the nuclear power plant in the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. So for the moment, there were no reports or no information for any evacuation, meaning that for the moment there is no real risk of something happening right now or right in the very nearest future. Of course, it could happen. The risk is still there because fightings are happening around, but still people are having this under certain up-to-date control. And for the moment, no evacuation was so it is possible to evacuate, but no evacuation which is absolutely must for the people from these areas. But we should understand that there is always danger and risks, and people are also informed about that. So in case people take this decision to leave, it's absolutely fine. But evacuation by the government will be done only in case some real leaks started or starting to happen.
And also, Anna, Russia said this yesterday. It's almost as if they are confident. And so did a top Russian diplomat, saying that Moscow hoped that a visit by the International Atomic Energy Agency to the Russian-controlled Zaporizhzhia station would dispel misconceptions about its allegedly poor state. What does Ukraine think?
Ukraine definitely is very interested for the mission to start. Ukraine wants clear and fair analysis of the situation because Ukrainian officials and Enerhoatom they have more, of course, details on the real state of the power plant, and they have enough details and enough information to be actually very worried about the state of the power plant. So it is important that it is either confirmed and actions are taken, because the main action here would be immediate demilitarization of the zone, or at least that the mission would check and say that the state of the plant is okay. But again, from what we hear from the chief of the agency and also from the international community of the experts and Ukrainian experts, that anyway, the state in which the Zaporizhzhia power plant is operating at the moment is not a normal situation, and it's very dangerous, because we should consider that this is the biggest in Europe atomic energy plant, and it's definitely not okay that it is a part of the military activity. So Ukraine hopes, and this is probably would be the main aim for the mission, to demilitarize this area and to make sure that the power plant is operating in safe conditions, in normal conditions, and hopefully it will be under the control of the experts.
And Anna, let's talk on the back of Memorial Day. We heard from President Zelensky, and also this is the fighting Ukrainian troops mounting counteroffensive, saying that they've broken through Russian defenses, several sectors near the city of Kherson. But then the Russians are saying that that is not true.
We have confirmation from the Ukrainian military officials, and also from some reports from the international media, which get information from international experts, sometimes anonymously, sometimes not. But the main idea is that the confirmed information for the moment is that Ukrainian forces are actually actually made it through the first line of defense of the Russian forces in Kherson region. So this was an official report from the General Staff of Ukraine, and also confirmed by a couple of, again, as I already said, international sources. And this is also something reported by the locals who are located in Kherson and in Kherson region, because of course this information is coming from the inside of these territories. We don't have a lot of details for the moment, because Ukrainian officials they confirmed that the action is going on, the counteroffensive actions are going on, but no details would be provided until the operation is done and until there are actual results, because for the moment everything is ongoing, and it's very dangerous to reveal any details on this particular actions. But we also have confirmation that Ukrainian forces managed to liberate a couple of villages. And we have also reports from the inside of Kherson and the region that there are a lot of explosions heard in Kherson and around Kherson. A lot of Russian bases were hit in the past days. And also today, Ukrainian forces destroyed one of the crosses over Dnipro River, this temporary crosses that Russian forces built to be able to move over the river. Due to these actions, again, this is what we have as a confirmed information from the General Staff. More than 80 Russian Russian soldiers were killed, and around 30 pieces of equipment, of military equipment, were destroyed. But again, we don't have, very much details on that. So what we only hear, and this is also what was said by the U.S. representatives, that there is definitely an activity going on in there, and we can say for the moment that this is counteroffensive actions which are happening, and there are certain advances being reported by the Ukrainian forces. But this is what we know for the moment, and more details might come when first results are in place.
And I would like to thank you. We appreciate you joining us today. Continue to stay safe.
Thank you.
And the United Nations chartered ship loaded with Ukrainian wheat destined for millions at risk of starvation in Ethiopia has arrived in Djibouti. This is according to the World Food Programme. The bulk carrier MV Brave Commander, which is carrying 23,000 tons of grain, docked in the Horn of Africa port city today, 2 weeks after leaving a Black Sea port in Ukraine. The WFP Executive Director, David Beasley, said on Twitter, "We have officially docked. The first WFP ship to carry Ukrainian grain since February has just arrived in Djibouti. Now let's get this wheat offloaded and on to Ethiopia." The UN agency said food insecurity and malnutrition are a major concern across Ethiopia, with an estimated 20.4 million people in need of food support. Ukraine, one of the world's largest grain exporters, was forced to halt almost all deliveries after Russia invaded the country, raising fears of a global food crisis. Exports of grains and other foodstuffs and fertilizers from 3 Black Sea ports resumed at the start of this month under a deal between Kyiv and Moscow that was brokered by the UN and Turkey in July. Elsewhere, European Union defense ministers at a meeting in Prague are set to pave the way for the establishment of an EU training mission for Ukrainian forces. This is according to the bloc's top diplomat, Josep Borrell. He told reporters as he arrived for talks in Prague that the situation on ground continues to be very bad.
This nuclear gambling in the nuclear power station, Zaporizhzhia, is something very dangerous. So the situation in the ground continues being very bad. Ukraine needs our support, and we will continue providing this support. The ministers will discuss about the idea of putting in place a high-level training mission for the Ukrainian army. A general and overall political agreement. That's what I think we have to get today. Later, the details will come. We have a procedure, quite complex, in order to identify the objective, the purpose that I mentioned, the resources. But today, I hope that we will have a green light, a political green light for this mission. Several member states will have different ideas. But this idea of a training mission, it's an old idea. We have been discussing that even before the war started. So member states put this idea on the table. So that's the moment to act. That's the moment to take decisions.
Still to come on the program. UK Chancellor Nadhim Zahawi visits US for talks on tackling spiraling cost of living. Please stay with us. Welcome back. The UK Chancellor Nadhim Zahawi is travelling to the United States for talks on how to tackle the spiraling cost of living. During what could be his final week on the job, Mr. Zahawi will meet US bankers and officials to seek international solutions to the soaring costs. Labour has criticised the trip, saying he should be focusing on the UK. The two candidates for Prime Minister have signalled they will offer more help if elected on the 5th of September. The government has been accused of not doing enough to help people cope with the crisis amid warnings that people are facing a dire winter with rocketing energy bills. Many people are having to make tough choices, such as skipping meals, while others are dreading the colder months. Both Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak, one of whom will be announced as the next Prime Minister, have pledged further support, though neither has given details. Well, joining us right now, our London correspondent Simon Pusey virtually. Hi, Simon. Mr. Zahawi has insisted he's been working tirelessly to come up with proposals for either leadership candidate to bring in more cost of living support. How is this trip being received in the UK? Will it bring the needed solutions?
Yeah, well, I think you said it in your introduction there, is that a lot of people are confused why he's doing this when he's probably not going to be in this job in a week's time. So a lot of people are thinking this is a bit of a waste of time and maybe too little too late. We've had this cost of living crisis coming for many weeks now. We've been talking about it for many months. And a lot of people are saying, well, why is he going to the United States when the problem is a global one, but it's here in the UK that he's in charge of? And, you know, Labour criticising it, as you said, that they're calling it an international chinwag. I think a lot of people would have said, well, why didn't you get together with the Prime Minister and ministers in the government weeks ago to come up with a plan for this? The Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, has been saying this isn't for me to do, this is for the next administration, for either Liz Truss or Rishi Sunak, sort of kicking the can down the road there. So I think most people are a little bit confused as to why he has to do this now and why he's going to America and not dealing with the crisis here in the UK.
Simon, are the global pressures the cause of the crisis? I mean, what are the common challenges affecting the economy right now?
Yeah, it's obviously a global thing. Every country seems to be having issues with this, and there are protests around the world due to the rising cost of living. And a lot of that is down to the war in Ukraine, of course. That means that food prices have gone up because grain shipments haven't been leaving Ukraine. And then Russia, obviously, with their energy, a lot of people depend on, you know, oil and gas from Russia, so that's obviously being squeezed. So the price of petrol is going up and gas. And then you've also got the pandemic, of course, which has caused economic slowdowns around the world, not least in China at the moment, where lockdowns seem to be happening a lot. And here in the UK, it's hard to avoid the fact that Brexit has caused pressures as well. You've got lots of trade restrictions now in place, and especially within Ireland. So I think it's a combination of those factors really that's causing the problem here in the UK. But it is a global one, and you've got protests happening in South Africa at the moment about the cost of living crisis, and in Sri Lanka. So it's certainly not something that's limited to the UK, but it is something that's very much affecting people here.
Both contenders for the next Prime Minister, Liz Truss, Rishi Sunak, they've pledged further support, but why aren't they giving any details?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think they both don't want to sort of get caught on the hop or don't want to say anything out of turn in terms of the cost of living. It's certainly such a big story here that I think emotions really run high, and I think they're a bit worried if they come out with something some firm proposals that people might be very unhappy if it's not what they want to hear. Rishi Sunak has unveiled a kind of a plan. He said he's prepared to find up to £10 billion to cut bills for poorer households. Liz Truss has been more vague, if anything, than Rishi Sunak. She's considering apparently cutting VAT by 5%, which Rishi Sunak said would be untenable, unsustainable. She hasn't ruled out direct households, help for direct households for energy bills. And she's mentioned maybe cutting taxes on green levies, on things to help the environment that she says are not helping people in terms of taxes. But they haven't come out and been direct at all in terms of coming out with a plan, 10 proposals or sets of things that they're going to do. I think just they're worried that the other one will, pile in and criticize their plan and say that it doesn't make economic sense. So that's something that people are actually quite upset about, because if you're going to elect someone as your prime minister in a week's time, on Monday next week, then people want to know what you're going to do, what your plans are going to be for what is a very important issue.
And we are edging closer to D-Day. Who's the favourite to win?
I think Liz Truss at the moment. Rishi Sunak was winning a lot of the early voting rounds, but that's a little bit different because that wasn't the Conservative membership that were voting then. That was MPs, but now it's going to be Conservative membership, so that's members of the Conservative Party up and down the country. And Liz Truss is just the favourite there. She's a lot more experienced. She's been around quite a lot longer. Rishi Sunak obviously sort of rose in popularity during the pandemic when he came out with all of those furlough schemes, and he gave away a lot of money and seemed to be quite competent, maybe compared to Boris Johnson. He seemed quite competent when he was speaking, seemed like he knew what he was doing, and fiscally quite responsible. He's the one that's saying you can't cut VAT. He's not going to cut VAT. He, in fact, rose VAT, despite that being a pledge of the Conservatives not to do that. And that was pretty unpopular. But he's saying that, the country needs to start paying off these bills, that we can't be massively in debt and paying interest on our debt. Whereas Liz Truss is saying something slightly different. She's saying that we can cut taxes, we can potentially cut VAT, and we shouldn't be trying to pay back these debts immediately. I think Liz Truss is the favourite. I think most people expect her to win this candidate race, unless something happens. They've got a few more debates happening. Interestingly, by the way, Liz Truss has pulled out of what was going to be quite a big interview with the BBC. She's pulled out of that. And again, I think it looks a bit like a sort of Boris Johnson tactic. He used to do that as well, would be to pull out of big interviews because people are worried, or they're worried that maybe they're going to say something that completely disrupts their campaign. I think it's in Liz Truss's interests really to say not much now, because she is the favourite and she just doesn't want a banana skin to slip up her campaign.
And talking about Boris Johnson, this is his about last week in office. What's he been doing? Yeah,
not much, really. A lot of people have been joking that he went to Ukraine recently. He went to see President Zelensky on their International Freedom Day, on their Liberation Day. And a lot of people were joking, that Boris Johnson is expected to make a surprise visit to the UK, because he just hasn't been in the UK the last few weeks. He's been on 2 holidays. He's had a marriage ceremony. And then he's been in Kiev. So a lot of people accusing him and his government of being a zombie government at the moment. And because he decided he wanted to stay on a few more months after he initially resigned, a lot of people are saying, what's the point, really? Because he hasn't really been doing much. Certainly Parliament's been on holiday for a couple of weeks, so they haven't been Prime Minister's questions. But yeah, you haven't really seen much of Boris Johnson. I think he's been enjoying his last few weeks in office. He's been working from Chequers, which is his country retreat, and so splitting his time between Downing Street and there. But it seems like he's been on a bit of a holiday. Obviously, he was in Kiev, and he's very popular there. President Volodymyr Zelensky says the UK is Ukraine's best friend, and Boris Johnson has been at the forefront of that. So he's won some plaudits for what he's done with Ukraine and taking on Russia. And giving support to Ukraine. I think the UK was the first to give military support in terms of aid. But politically here, he hasn't really been around doing much. There haven't been many big announcements. I think he's sort of taking his foot off the pedal just before he steps down in a week's time.
I'm sure they still wish him all the best. Thanks, Simon Pusey, our London correspondent, joining us there. Thanks again. And away from the United Kingdom, scores marched in the funeral procession of supporters of Muqtada Al-Sadr in Najaf city today, many of whom were killed during clashes in Baghdad. Mourners took to the streets of Najaf carrying the coffins, chanting slogans in support of Sadr. Clashes on Monday between rival Shiite Muslim groups killed nearly 20 people, jolted Iraq into new violence as supporters of Shiite cleric Al-Sadr, a former anti-US insurgent leader, faced off with Shiite armed groups most loyal to Iran. A prolonged political deadlock after an October election during which the two camps have competed for power has given the country its longest run without a government and led to new unrest as Iraq struggles to recover from decades of conflict. And to Sri Lanka, where the President Ranil Wickremesinghe today presented an interim budget to boost revenue and fight inflation in the country, and said talks with the International Monetary Fund, IMF, on a bailout package have made solid progress. The island nation of 22 million people is battling its worst economic crisis since independence from Britain in 1948. Wickremesinghe, who took over as the country's president last month, is pushing to bring in fiscal consolidation measures agreed with the IMF, which currently has a team of officials visiting Sri Lanka. Sri Lankan officials hope the budget will be followed by a preliminary staff-level agreement with the IMF for a loan package worth between $2 billion and $3 billion. Chronic shortages of basic foods, runaway inflation, and mass protests forced then-President Gotabaya Rajapaksa to flee the country in July, leaving his successor to handle the restructuring of billions of dollars in debt to China and other countries. And the United Nations mission in South Sudan has received a new force commander to help with the peacekeeping operations in the country. The new commander says he is privileged to be with the South Sudanese people and looks forward to earnestly performing his duties for the cause of durable peace and stability.
Sunny skies in South Sudan welcome the new United Nations mission in South Sudan force commander, Lieutenant General Mohan Subramanian, from India, as he began his tour of duty in the world's largest peacekeeping mission. After accepting the handover of charge from Deputy Force Commander Main Ullah Chowdhury, it was time for the new head of the military component to inspect an honor guard where peacekeepers from Rwanda, Nepal, China, Ethiopia, Bangladesh and India marked his arrival.
Any military leader leading a multinational force is a matter of honor. That I have been afforded the opportunity to do so at Unrest, which is the largest United Nations peacekeeping mission in the world today, in South Sudan, which is the youngest country of the world today. That is indeed a great privilege, honor and pride. With utmost humility, I take up this honor and promise that I would earnestly endeavor and meaningfully contribute to the cause of sustainable peace here along with the mission.
This isn't the force commander's first stint with UN peacekeeping, having served as a blue helmet in the United Nations mission in Sierra Leone, and he prioritizes the power of partnerships in achieving peace and progress.
There is a common strain in Sierra Leone and other missions and South Sudan, which is the fact that unless there is a collaborative effort of all stakeholders within the mission, within the UN family, between the UN family and the regional, international, and most importantly the national partners, as well as the South Sudanese communities. Without such a collaborative effort, the path to sustainable peace may be slow, and therefore it is of prime importance to achieve such collaboration.
The top military man at United Nations mission in South Sudan has already hit the ground running, meeting the mission's senior leaders to understand the political and security complexities in South Sudan as troops under his command work to protect civilians.
According to the World Health Organization, it is possible to eliminate the monkeypox outbreak in Europe, highlighting evidence that case counts are slowing in a handful of countries. WHO Regional Director for Europe, Hans Kluge, said there are encouraging signs of a sustained week-on-week decline in the onset of cases in many European countries, including France, Germany, Portugal, Spain and Britain, as well as a slowdown in some parts of the United States despite scarce vaccine supplies. The rollout of Bavarian Nordic's Bava.co monkeypox vaccine has been affected by a limited supply of the shot, which is also approved to prevent smallpox, although regulators are taking steps to stretch out existing stocks.
We have seen a week-on-week decline in many countries.
The European region recording more than 22,000 confirmed cases across 43 countries and areas, representing more than a third of the global tally. There are encouraging early signs, as evidenced in France, Germany, Portugal, Spain, the United Kingdom and other countries, that the outbreak may be slowing. To move towards elimination in our region, we need to urgently step up our efforts. Yet we believe we can eliminate sustained human-to-human transmission of monkeypox in the region if we commit to doing so and put the needed resources towards that end.
And we have seen a week-on-week decline in many countries, particularly those 4 or 5 countries that are seeing the largest number of cases. And the reasons for that are probably a variety of reasons. Earlier detection, which leads to patients isolating themselves sooner when they know that they have the disease. Behavioural changes. We do have some pretty good anecdotal evidence that people are, particularly men who have sex with men who are in particular risk groups, are much more informed about the disease.
You mentioned on flu and COVID.
Coming up next. It's Pakistan facing a monsoon on steroids. The UN Secretary General warns after floods submerged a third of the country. An Australian court has found a former high school teacher who was the subject of the hit podcast, The Teacher's Pet, guilty of murdering his wife 40 years ago after public attention triggered renewed interest in the case. The guilty verdict marks a dramatic conclusion to a cold case that has gripped Australia since the 2018 podcast put pressure on police to revisit their investigation. A 2003 inquest had recommended charging Christopher Dawson with his wife's murder, but prosecutors declined, citing a lack of evidence.
Circumstantial evidence in this case, considered as a whole, is persuasive and compelling. None of the circumstances considered alone can establish Mr. Dawson's guilt, but when regard is had to their combined force, I am left in no doubt. I'm satisfied beyond reasonable doubt that the only rational inference that the circumstances enable me to draw is that Lynette Dawson died on about 8 January 1982 as the result of a conscious and voluntary act committed by Mr. Dawson with the intention of causing her death. Christopher Michael Dawson, on the charge that on or about 8 January 1982 at Bayview or elsewhere in the state of New South Wales, you did murder Lynette Dawson. I find you guilty. You may sit down. Mr. Dawson, it will be necessary for you to be taken into custody.
This verdict is for Lynn. Today her name has been cleared. She loved her family and never left them of her own accord. Instead, her trust was betrayed by a man she loved. The court has found what we have believed to be true for so many years. Chris Dawson took the life of our beloved Lynn back in 1982. On behalf of our family, our heartfelt thanks to all who came forward to speak the truth on Lynn's behalf, to give her a voice 40 years after she lost her own.
I feel like I've even got to know Lynn, although I could never have known her. You know, I was, I guess, 16 when she disappeared, but her story struck me as so unjust, so unfair at the time. And, you know, I think it's true, I did become obsessive about it. I think people who do understand the evidence in this case have the same feeling because it is so immediately unfair. And let's remember, it's taken 40 years for this to happen.
We're staying in Australia, where a regulator has sent legal letters to Facebook, owner of Meta Platforms, Apple Inc., Microsoft Corp, Snapchat Inc., and others, demanding they share their strategies for stamping out child abuse material on their platforms or face fines. The E-Safety Commissioner, a body set up to protect internet users, said it used laws which took effect in January to compel the technology giants to disclose measures that they were taking to detect and remove abuse material within 28 days. If they did not, the companies would each face a fine of $383,000 per day. Joining us now, Victor Ekwalo. He's a technology analyst. He joins me for more on that. Thanks, Victor. I mean, this move underscores Australia's hardline approach to regulating big tech firms. But what do you think is changing with these firms?
Thank you very much for having me. A lot of things has changed over the years, and one of it is that social media has grown in popularity and size to a very large extent. Take, for instance, in the year 2010, there were 970 million people on social media across the world. As we speak now, there are over 4.4 billion people on social media. That's like more than half of the world's population, known population, right? And this means that to a very large extent, social media moderation has become really difficult for most of these companies. So they started out as like real small upstarts, working it on the fly. And to a very large extent, content moderation on social media is broken, right? There's no standard to it. There's no unified standard. It's not like, oh, this is the way things are done to a very large extent. So everybody makes up things as they go on the fly. And this leaves room for a lot of misinterpretations, and it leaves room for a lot of the problems you see every day from some of the bigger social media platforms.
And specifically, Australia's regulator is saying disclose measures you're taking to detect, remove abuse material within, a number of days, or else pay a fine. It said they saw child sexual exploitation in many different forms, supercharged by the COVID pandemic. Is there a way these tech firms can actually monitor this illegal content and also regulate the space?
There is to a very large extent. Like I mentioned earlier, so content moderation, which is how most of these tech social media platforms take away, content that have been deemed to violate the platform's policies and like rules. And common sense rules to a very large extent. So by deplatforming, deleting, removing it from the platform. There are a bunch of, moderation rules that guide this. But content moderation on social media has become really difficult over the years. And the more, social media penetration grows across the world, the more difficult it becomes. And one of the ways that they have done this is by hiring more people, which has proven not to be very efficient because there's only so much people that to moderate the billions of people that are on these platforms. Another recent thing that has gotten much popularity has been artificial intelligence. So basically, engineers build these machine learning models and feed programs into them that say, oh, this is what's determined to be harmful behavior. Take it off if you find it. Now, there are two layers to AI moderation, content moderation. There is the surface level layer where it's just common sense. Like you see something that looks like porn, this artificial intelligence program, take it out. Then there is the context-based layer where human interaction is informed, and because this is still very nascent and requires a lot more training to happen. To a very large extent, to answer your question more specifically, yes, there are ways that they can do this, but it's increasingly difficult and getting more difficult by the day for them to do.
Do we have such regulation on major tech giants in Nigeria? Also, is there an age limit to opening a social media account?
To your first question, yes, there is the Code Practice Act that was in June of this year, June 2022, by NIDA in Nigeria, and basically it's an act that says, oh, social media platforms operating in Nigeria, these are the things you can do with data. That's like the closest thing that we have to that in Nigeria. And there is the NDPR, Nigeria Data Protection Regulations, that protects users on social media. Apart from that, I don't know that we've had any like really hard-hitting, stances on some social media, like data and all that kind of stuff in Nigeria. But yes, the Code Practice Act in June, and there's the NDPR. For age to get on social media, most social media platforms put them at 13 and 14 years. But with parental control or with the parental guide, a lot of platforms now allow younger people to get on, as long as they can say, oh, this account is being managed by the parents, turn off some features and all that kind of stuff.
I think we need to strengthen our laws, our regulation even more. Yes,
to a very large extent, yes. I think that there's a place. So when it comes to Nigeria, a lot of the laws that have been enacted, a lot of the acts, a lot of the bills that have been targeted at social media have been more tilted towards strangulating, user rights, free speech, as opposed to checking the platforms themselves. And this is more injurious to the users than what it's supposed to be, which is like checking the platforms, which is what like happens in other countries. In Nigeria, it's more like, oh, you can't do this, you can't do that, laws that want to jail you for what you say on social media. I think there should be more laws, more bills, more enactments that are targeted at the companies, what they do with our data, what they do with content moderation on a very local level, and things that are targeted more at protecting the user than, stifling their expression on the platforms, basically.
Victor Okwalo is a technology analyst. We'd like to thank you for joining us on the program.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks, and we go over talking about Pakistan facing a monsoon on steroids. The UN Secretary General has warned after floods submerged a third of the country. Antonio Guterres urged the world to come to Pakistan's aid as he launched a $160 million appeal to help the tens of millions affected in the disaster. He blamed the relentless impact of epochal levels of rain and flooding. At least 1,136 people have been killed since June, and roads, crops, homes, and bridges washed away across the country. This year's record monsoon is comparable to the devastating floods of 2010, the deadliest in Pakistan's history, which left more than 2,000 people dead. In a video message, Mr. Guterres called South Asia a climate crisis hotspot where people were, he said, 15 times more likely to die from climate impacts. According to him, let's stop sleepwalking towards the destruction of our planet by climate change. Today it's Pakistan, tomorrow it could be your country. And despite cost of living fears, heat waves and wildfires, the summer 2022 is looking to have been good for the French tourism industry as local and foreign holidaymakers swarmed the country after the COVID-19 pandemic rattled the sector during 2 years. Streets in the iconic Montmartre neighborhood were bustling with activity as tourists browsed items in gift shops, booked tables at restaurants, took selfies in front of the basilica. And that's our program this evening. Thank you for watching. I'm Millicent Walker.